Bookman-Wicker didn't expect anything unusual that morning. She'd made this trip so many times, she could have walked the route blindfolded. Dallas to Washington, D.C., first class, always seat 2A. Same airport, same gate, same quiet corner in the Admirals Club where they knew her by name. Her world was predictable, controlled. And that's exactly how she liked it. She stepped into Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport with her usual quiet elegance. Not the showy kind, not loud, but the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you belong. Her heels clicked steadily against the polished floor, a subtle rhythm that echoed with familiarity. Behind her, her champagne gold carry-on glided silently, wheels whispering over tile. It wasn't just luggage, it was part of her armor, sleek, sophisticated, perfectly matched to her tailored navy coat. She moved through security with ease. The TSA agent offered a polite nod. She returned it. No words, no delays. In the lounge, she sipped warm chamomile from fine porcelain, flipped through the day's headlines on her tablet, and made a mental checklist for the board meeting ahead. Everything felt smooth, polished, intentional. By the time her gate was called, she was already standing, not eager, just prepared. She boarded early. As always, her boarding pass scanned with a friendly smile from the agent. The flight attendant welcomed her with that slight lift of the chin, the one that said, "You've done this before." Joanne walked into the first-class cabin like she'd walked into it 100 times before. The lighting was soft. The air carried a hint of citrus and leather. Row 1 passed, then row 2. She saw her seat, 2A, waiting, familiar. But something wasn't right. Someone was already in 2B. He sat upright, composed. A man in his 40s, maybe younger. Dark skin. Crisp navy suit. A slim black laptop rested on the tray in front of him, fingers moving across the keys with quiet efficiency. He didn't glance up, didn't fidget, didn't even pause. Focused, calm. Joanne slowed, not enough to draw attention, but just enough to feel her own hesitation. She looked again, seat 2B, right next to hers. The man didn't even acknowledge her presence. She blinked once, then moved forward, lifting her bag with practiced ease into the overhead bin. She adjusted the angle twice, not because it needed adjusting, but because she needed a second longer. Then she sat down, gently, poised, back straight. She adjusted her scarf, crossed her legs, placed her handbag precisely on her lap. Still, nothing from the man beside her. He kept typing. Joanne glanced sideways quickly. A flick of her eyes, he was completely immersed in whatever was on his screen. No smile, no polite nod, no awareness of her presence at all. That was unusual. She didn't expect conversation, of course. This was first class. People respected silence. But still, something about his calmness, his self-possession, felt almost dismissive. She turned back to the window, lips pressed into a line. A small frown appeared just for a second before disappearing behind practiced composure. It wasn't anything he said. He hadn't said a word, but somehow that made it worse. This wasn't how first class was supposed to feel. Joanne settled into her seat slowly, carefully. Her movements were smooth but not relaxed. Her spine was straight, her expression fixed. As she reached for the armrest, her elbow brushed against his, just barely, but enough for her to register it. She paused, then pulled her arm back slightly, just enough to reclaim her space without making a scene. No apology, no acknowledgement. Not from him, not even a glance. Joanne exhaled quietly through her nose. Not a sigh, exactly. Just controlled air. She adjusted the strap of her handbag, shifted it slightly on her lap, smoothed a wrinkle in her skirt that wasn't really there, and then almost without thinking she turned slightly toward him. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Her voice was light, almost friendly, but there was a sharpness under it. Thin, practiced. The man didn't look up. "Yes," he said. "Just that. Nothing more." His fingers never stopped moving on the keyboard. Joanne waited a second, as if expecting him to follow up, offer an explanation, a smile, a nod, anything. But there was nothing. Her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer, searching for something, some sign of hesitation or guilt. She found none. Back in her younger days, people had always responded to her. A smile got a smile back, a question got a polite answer, and when it didn't, there was usually a reason. This was indifference. She turned back toward the front of the cabin, lips pressed together. Her eyes flicked forward, then back again. He was still typing. Joanne shifted slightly in her seat, crossed her legs, uncrossed them. Her fingers tapped lightly against the edge of the armrest, once, twice, then stilled. She looked around the cabin, as if searching for a better explanation than the one forming in her mind. A businessman across the aisle sipped quietly from a glass. A couple 2 rows up leaned in, heads together, whispering softly. Everything seemed normal. Everything except this. The man beside her wasn't nervous. He wasn't fidgeting. He wasn't pretending not to notice her. He genuinely didn't seem to care that she was there at all. And that, for Joanne, was harder to accept than any act of rudeness. Because it wasn't disrespect. It was disinterest. And that made her feel invisible. She glanced toward the front of the cabin. A flight attendant, young, sharp, composed, was helping an older woman settle into row 4. Joanne recognized her from previous flights. Rachel. She was quick, efficient, and always respectful. Joanne raised her hand slightly, elegantly. Not a wave, just enough to signal. Rachel noticed immediately. She gave a small nod and began making her way down the aisle. As Joanne waited, she kept her posture composed, but her eyes drifted again toward the man beside her. Still typing, still silent. She didn't understand it. She didn't like it. And more than that, she wasn't used to it. Rachel approached with her usual composed grace, tablet in hand, a soft professional smile on her face. "Yes, ma'am?" she asked gently. Joanne leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to sound discreet, just enough to sound reasonable. "I think there may have been a mistake," she said, smiling lightly, the way one does when pretending something's funny. "I've flown this route dozens of times, and I just don't recall anyone ever sitting in that seat." Rachel glanced at Julian. He was still working, not looking up, entirely unfazed. The flight attendant tapped a few times on her tablet. Her expression remained calm, but her eyebrows shifted just slightly, an almost invisible flicker of something. After a pause, she looked up again. "No mistake, ma'am," she said kindly. "You're in 2A, Mr. Ross is in 2B. Everything matches the manifest." She tilted the screen forward, showing the seat map and names in bold text. Factual, final. Joanne looked at the screen but didn't really see it. "Oh, I see," she replied, her voice light, her laugh forced and brittle. "Well, these systems change so often. Hard to keep up sometimes, isn't it?" Rachel offered a polite smile. "Let me know if you need anything else." Then she stepped back and returned to her duties, efficient as ever. But Joanne sat still, her smile fading the moment Rachel turned away. Inside, something boiled. She adjusted the angle of her purse, shifted in her seat, crossed her legs the other way, her fingers fidgeted with the edge of the tray table. Tap, pause, then stillness. Julian didn't move, still typing, still silent, still utterly undisturbed. His quiet wasn't casual, it was solid, intact, untouchable. Joanne glanced at him again. He hadn't so much as flinched when she questioned his presence. No defensiveness, no effort to explain, just a calm, wordless certainty that he belonged there. It rattled her more than she cared to admit. He was supposed to react, supposed to reassure her. Apologize, flinch, something, but no, he was focused, grounded, untouched by her discomfort. She turned forward again, her lips pressed into a thin, steady line. But her thoughts spiraled. Why didn't he say anything? Why didn't he look at her? Why did he seem so sure of his place? Her body couldn't quite settle. She shifted again. Her elbow inched away from the shared armrest, then returned, then inched away again. Across the aisle, the businessman glanced up from his tablet. Nothing more than a flick of the eyes, but she caught it, and it stung. A woman 3 rows ahead tucked a blanket over her lap and adjusted her seat. Joanne found herself watching, envying the ease of it. She turned back slightly, stole one more glance at Julian, still typing, still silent. It wasn't what he was doing. It was what he wasn't doing. No eye contact, no acknowledgement, no effort to engage with her presence or her disapproval. That was what made her skin prickle, because she wasn't used to being ignored. She was used to being noticed, listened to, accommodated, respected. But now, she was sitting inches away from someone who behaved as though she was air. And Joanne Whitaker didn't take kindly to being invisible. Joanne sat a little too still, her body composed, her posture perfect, but the stillness wasn't peace. It was calculation. Her fingers tightened around the armrest. Then, with slow, deliberate motion, she reached up and pressed the call button. The soft chime sounded overhead. Rachel appeared moments later, still carrying that calm, measured professionalism. "Yes, ma'am?" Joanne leaned slightly toward her. Her tone was polite, her voice lowered, just enough to sound private, just enough to sound reasonable. "I'd like to request a seat change," she said. Rachel blinked once, not startled, just surprised. "Of course. Is there an issue with the seat itself? Something uncomfortable?" Joanne hesitated, only for a second. But in that silence something unspoken pulsed in the air. "No, it's not the seat," she said quietly. "I just don't feel very comfortable." The way she said it, soft, restrained, made it sound like a confession. Not aggressive, not confrontational, just delicate, as if spoken from a place of vulnerability. Rachel's eyes flicked briefly toward Julian. He was still typing, unmoved, unbothered. She nodded once and tapped gently on her tablet. "I'll check to see if there's another seat available." Joanne offered a tight smile. "Thank you." There was a pause as Rachel scrolled through the manifest. A few seconds passed. Then, "I'm afraid first class is fully booked. There are no open seats." Joanne didn't respond right away. She nodded, slowly, almost thoughtfully, then turned her gaze back to Rachel. "And what about coach?" Her voice was even, soft, almost kind. Rachel paused. "There are 2 seats available in economy," she said carefully. Joanne tilted her head, her lips curling into something that looked like understanding, but didn't feel like it. "Well then," she glanced for the briefest moment toward Julian. "Maybe he could take one of those?" The words were smooth, balanced, deadly. Rachel didn't move, not yet. But across the aisle, a man shifted in his seat. 2 rows back, a woman raised her eyebrows and glanced at her husband. Someone cleared their throat just a little too deliberately. Julian still hadn't said a word, still hadn't looked up. And yet, somehow, he was the one holding the room. Rachel didn't respond right away. She stood still for a moment, professional, collected, but there was a subtle shift in her stance, just enough to suggest discomfort, or maybe disbelief. Then, quietly, carefully, "Ma'am, do you feel threatened?" The words hung in the air like smoke. Joanne's eyes flicked toward Julian, then back to Rachel. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she folded her hands neatly in her lap, took in a slow breath, held it, then exhaled. "I'm not saying that," she replied softly. Her tone was steady, even warm. "I just don't feel safe, that's all." The cabin quieted, even more than before. No beeping seatbelt signs, no rustle of newspapers, no hushed conversations. Silence. And then, Julian stopped typing, deliberately. He closed his laptop with a gentle click, placed his hands flat on top of it, and turned his head. This time, he looked directly at her. His gaze wasn't angry, wasn't hostile. It was calm, unwavering, penetrating, like he was no longer listening, but measuring. And for the first time since stepping on the plane, Joanne felt something new. Not discomfort, not irritation, doubt. Her composure held, barely. But something behind her eyes shifted. Rachel glanced between them, then stepped slightly closer. Her voice lowered, firmer. "Just so I understand, you want me to ask him to move, because you don't feel safe sitting next to him?" Joanne didn't answer. She turned to the window instead, eyes fixed on nothing. Her reflection in the glass stared back at her, still composed, still polished, but no longer in control. Julian didn't speak. Not right away. He didn't raise his voice, didn't roll his eyes, didn't even flinch. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, smooth, unhurried, like someone retrieving a boarding pass. From within, he pulled out a slim leather case, worn at the corners, plain, unremarkable, until he opened it. The badge inside gleamed gold under the cabin lights. The seal was unmistakable. Bold letters beneath it read, "Federal Bureau of Investigation." The air inside the plane changed. Someone in row 1 leaned forward, just slightly. A passenger across the aisle blinked, lips parting. Even Rachel's eyes flickered for the first time. But Julian, he was calm. He held the badge open, not in anger, not in triumph, but in complete, measured confidence. Then he turned to Joanne, looked her in the eye, and said in the same calm voice he hadn't raised once, "Would you like to file an official complaint, ma'am?" A pause, not rushed, not threatening. "I can take your statement right now." Joanne froze. Her mouth opened, then closed. Her eyes darted from the badge to Julian's face, then to Rachel, still standing beside them, expression unreadable. She tried to speak, but the words stuck. Behind them, 3 rows back, a young woman held her phone just slightly above the seat in front of her. She wasn't texting, and she recorded. For a while, Julian didn't look away, didn't blink. He didn't need to raise his voice, because the badge did the talking now. Joanne sat motionless, her breath shallow, hands trembling in her lap, though she tried to hide it. For a moment, nothing moved, and in that silence, something became very clear. Joanne Whitaker wasn't the one in control anymore. The rest of the flight passed in silence. Joanne didn't speak, didn't move. Her hands lay frozen on her lap, one thumb quietly rubbing the edge of the other. A nervous tick she hadn't shown in years. Julian had already returned to his laptop, as if nothing had happened. As if he'd seen this kind of thing before, more than once, and he probably had. The badge was back in his jacket now, but the memory of it, the weight of what it meant, still hovered in the air like static. Joanne stared out the window, eyes unfocused, barely aware of the descent announcement from the pilot. Somewhere behind her a notification dinged, then another, and another. She tried to ignore it, but her phone was buzzing now, non-stop. Inside her handbag, it pulsed like a heartbeat she couldn't control. By the time the wheels touched down in Washington, D.C., she had 17 missed calls, 12 texts, 4 voicemails, and at least 3 emails flagged urgent. She stepped off the plane quickly, shoulders back, chin high, still holding on to whatever dignity she had left. But her walk was too fast, too tense. Eyes followed her. Not everyone stared, but they didn't have to. Some just watched from the corners of their eyes. Some pretended to scroll their phones while peeking above the screen. One man shook his head slowly as she passed. The jet bridge opened into the terminal, and that's when she saw them. 2 young people, barely out of college, stood near baggage claim. Camera phone mounted on a handheld rig, a microphone marked with the logo of a digital news site. The girl's eyes widened. She tapped her partner on the arm. "That's her," she whispered. Then louder, "Are you Joanne Whitaker?" Joanne didn't answer, didn't look. She turned hard to the right and moved quickly through the crowd. Her chest was tight, her breath shallow. She didn't run, she couldn't, but her pace was too quick for composure. She shoved through the terminal doors and flagged the first taxi she saw, nearly slammed the door behind her. "Go," she said, voice sharp. "Just drive." The cabbie glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Didn't say a word, just pulled away. Joanne leaned back in the seat, hands pressed to her temples, eyes closed. But she couldn't shut it out. Her phone buzzed again, and again. She reached into her bag with trembling fingers, unlocked the screen. The video was everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, uploaded, reposted, stitched, captioned. The title hit her like a slap. "Racist woman tries to get black FBI agent kicked out of first class." Her name hadn't been tagged yet, but her face was unmistakable. She opened a message from a friend she hadn't spoken to in months. "Joanne, is this real? Please tell me this was taken out of context." She didn't respond. The screen dimmed in her hand, then lit up again, this time a number she recognized. She answered, slowly, a pause, then a voice she knew well. Flat, professional, final. "Joanne," it said. "This is Martin from the board." She closed her eyes. "We've seen the video," he continued. "We expect your resignation by morning." She tried to reply, tried to say something, but nothing came out. The line went dead. Joanne stared down at the phone. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the screen, washed out, tired, older than she remembered. The cab rolled on, but the weight in her chest stayed still. And for the first time that day, she realized there was no flight home from this. The apartment was quiet. Not peaceful, not cozy, just quiet. Joanne sat in the same high-backed chair she always favored, forward, the one near the window, overlooking the city skyline she once felt so much a part of. Now the buildings looked farther away, colder, like they didn't recognize her anymore. Her phone sat untouched on the coffee table. It had stopped buzzing hours ago. The screen was dark now, silent. She picked it up anyway, out of habit, out of hope. She wasn't sure. She opened one of the videos, just one. The one that had the most views. The comments moved faster than she could read them. But one caught her eye. She ruined her entire career in under 10 minutes. It was short, blunt, cruel in its accuracy. She scrolled down looking for something, a defense, a question, a moment of doubt from someone who once admired her. There was nothing. No one was defending her. No one was asking if there was more to the story. No one was checking in to see how she was. People she had mentored, spoken for, led, they had vanished. Not with a bang, just with silence. The kind of silence that speaks volumes. The kind that doesn't need words to say, "We saw, and we've decided." She lowered the phone again, stared out the window. Outside, life moved on. Somewhere across the city, in a glass building not far from the Capitol, Julian Ross walked into a conference room. Badge clipped to his belt, tablet in hand, jacket buttoned, calm. He nodded to his team, sat at the head of the table. The meeting began. No one there mentioned the flight. No one asked what had happened, because, for Julian, it was just another day, another seat he had to prove he belonged in, another battle he didn't start, another storm he walked through, quietly, completely, and without apology. Joanne sat alone in her chair. No noise, no answers, just the soft hum of consequences unfolding in silence. And sometimes, silence is the loudest judgment of all. If this story moved you, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us keep telling powerful, meaningful stories that matter. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life moments that inspire, challenge, and connect us all. Thank you for being here. It means more than you know.